My name is Aditya. Thank you, Laura, for the introduction. As she said, what we're going to talk about today is how small teams can build and sell to much larger enterprises. The traditional story of David versus Goliath. I'm going to start with a question. How many of you currently work at an early stage startup? Wow, okay. That's a lot more than I was expecting. That's good. Or how many of you are founders? Okay, also quite a lot. Great. If you have not worked at a startup before, perhaps you've taken an enterprise product from 0 to 1 before. Anyone done that? Cool. Okay, awesome. Like I'm thinking like, someone maybe at GitHub started Copilot from scratch, that type of thing. Cool. All right, so then a lot of you probably know what this feels like. Most of you are probably, as I was, that little David looking up at all these Goliaths of the world, right? Like if you're trying to build technology, you're trying to build like new products, and you're trying to sell it to enterprises, it can almost feel like this. Like you're going up against these like colossus beings, like these big enterprises. They move really slow. They're super powerful, like really scary stuff, right? Not demure by any means. So the first question you might ask yourself, like maybe you did ask yourself this before you started a company. Do I want to do this? Do you want to sell to big companies, right? Like the first question you might ask is like, why would you even do this in the first place? Why not just, like if you're a small team, why not just sell to small companies? Like sell to other startups, sell to small and medium-sized businesses, right? Like go do that first before you start selling to enterprises. Well, I would actually argue that a lot of the cool stuff that gets built, some of the most complex things that actually get built are actually for enterprises. They're the ones that have the toughest problems. They're the ones where like software has, can be applied in the best way. As an example, here's Y Combinator's request for startups. This is like, if you guys are familiar with Y Combinator, they usually put out this request of topics like every few years. I think they refresh it every once in a while. They just refreshed it recently, like a few weeks ago. These are like the list of topics. So if you're interested in starting a company and you want to get funded by YC, maybe like pick one of these. But what I wanted to call out from here is that I would actually argue that if you looked at like the 20 or so ideas that are up here, at least half, if not more, have something to do with building for really large companies, like building something novel, some new technology that is applicable to really large companies. Like even just so, like look at this like number 12 over here, LLMs for manual back office processes in legacy enterprises. That's a mouthful, but those are things that like really large companies will pay a lot of money for, right? Here's another example. This is a quote from Patrick McKenzie. He's at PatIO11 on Twitter. Really interesting person to follow. Has like a pretty big blog following. Also, I think Patrick was one of the early employees at Stripe that started Stripe Atlas, which is like their like startup program. He argues in one of his blog posts, funny enough, called "Don't Call Yourself a Programmer," where he basically says 90% of programming jobs are in creating line of business software. Most software is boring one-off applications and corporations. In essence, like software solves business problems. That's what software is really, really good at, right? So hopefully this convinces you that even if you're a small company trying to get off the ground, if you have an interesting technology or if you have like an interesting approach in a particular market, enterprise might actually be a good proving ground for that. And so you should lean into it. So going back to David versus Goliath, then how do you actually slay Goliath? How do you like conquer this big being that's in front of you? How do you sell to these enterprises? You actually don't. You're not trying to slay Goliath. You're trying to like climb on top of his shoulder and you're trying to be his eyes and ears, right? These enterprises are not combative in nature. They're not there to basically not use a solution if it works for them. They actually do want to partner with companies. I mean, I think the biggest example you can think of just in the last, 6 months to a year, like look at ChatGPT and how big it's gotten in pretty much all enterprises around the world, like all the Fortune 500s, right? If there is value to be had from technology, enterprises are going to be one of the first to adopt it. So you just have to get to this point. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today, or at least my experiences with that. First, a little bit of an introduction since I didn't give one. I'm Aditya. I'm an engineering manager at WorkOS. Prior to WorkOS, I was a co-founder and the CEO of Warrant, warrant.dev. We'll get to that later. I have 10 plus years of experience building all kinds of consumer and enterprise products, companies like Lyft, Medallia, Yahoo. Most importantly, though, I'm a very technical person. I'm an engineer, been an engineering manager. I am by no means a salesperson or a marketing expert by training. So everything that I'm going to be talking about today is basically things that I picked up over the course of building my startup. So yeah, what is Warrant? Warrant is a company that I started back in 2021. I started it along with my brother, who also happens to be a technical co-founder. So both of us, being engineers, we came up with this idea, applied to Y Combinator. We're part of Y Combinator's Summer 21 batch. Fast forward, and I'll get to what happened in between, but fast forward to 2024, just a few months ago, we were actually acquired by WorkOS. So a lot happened in between. But before I get into that, what problem were we actually trying to solve with Warrant? I would, to kind of explain this a little bit, I would first say that probably everyone in this room has used some type of like business software, right? Is that a fair assumption to make? Whether it's something like Salesforce, Workday for HR, Rippling, like all kinds of software. If so, you've probably dealt with application permissions, like who has access to what. RBAC is like a term that comes to mind, right? Role-based access control. Admins can do certain things that non-admins can't, or vice versa. But the thing is that over the last few years, specifically over the last few years, and even now more so with AI, things have just gotten crazy complicated. A lot of business applications are they're building even more granular permissions into their products. In this like zero trust age that we're currently in, it's no longer about like if you're a manager, you can see certain things. There's a ton of user generated content out there. And so you have to protect things like at the resource or at the object level. And turns out that that's actually a very difficult technical problem to solve. Most companies, like if you're Salesforces of the world, you end up basically staffing an engineering team to go build this in-house, right? Like you will have a team of maybe 2 engineers all the way up to like 15, 20 engineers building and scaling this like granular permission system, which by the way is like not your core product. So you still have to do that. This is where Warrant comes in. So with Warrant, we built a managed, centralized, fine-grained authorization service. Requires no maintenance, plugs into pretty much any tech stack, supports all kinds of different authorization models. And the best part is that it scales to billions of authorization rules. So if you want like a sophisticated authorization system like what Salesforce has, you no longer need to build it. You can use something like Warrant. To illustrate, here's like a quick example. Think of Warrant as being somewhat like a permissions database. It contains all kinds of facts, these little authorization rules, somewhat like this format. So what this is saying is that there is a user, Bruno, who is an owner of a report X. Now multiply this by like hundreds of thousands or millions of these things that exist within your system. And Warrant is basically really good at querying this, checking against this data from basically anywhere in the application stack. And from a developer's perspective, the best part is it takes your ugly code that kind of looks like this, a bunch of if-else conditions. Maybe you've written code like this, but like all of these like permissions checks all over the place with something as clean as this, just a simple warrant check. So in essence, you're abstracting away your gnarly permissions logic away from your core application. Sound good so far? So in summary, Warrant is an authorization service purpose-built to solve the problems faced by mid-size and larger software companies. Now, what do I mean by mid-size? If you're a startup, you can use Warrant and you'll see a lot of benefits from it. Like if you're building something from scratch, super easy to get started. But I would say that the largest value that we provide is to customers where your engineering teams are like size maybe 20 to 30 or bigger. Your product is like super complicated and you need this type of fine-grained permission system. So that's really like our bread and butter. Over the course of the past 3 years, we've worked with all kinds of different startups, scale-ups, enterprises, companies that are building like CRM tools, health tech companies, fintech, and then more recently like AI and all kinds of other stuff. I don't know if I mentioned this, but Warrant was just a team of 3. It was myself, another co-founder, and we had one other engineer. And so for the past 3 years, we kind of did everything ourselves. So if you look at like the go-to-market motion, that's essentially me. I handled everything: the inbound, outbound, RFPs, NDAs, contracts, everything else that has to do with sales. Getting this product in front of customers was basically all handled by myself. Something else I'll call out here that we're super proud of is we built and scaled this cloud service to serve millions of API requests per day. In production today, we have customers using and relying on authorization, on our authorization service within their applications. Anyways, I could be up here talking for hours about all the things some of the things we did right, all the things that we did wrong, a lot of the lessons learned, but I'm not going to do that because then I'll be up here for hours. Instead, what I'm going to try to do is summarize a lot of our learnings, especially on the go-to-market side, into this concept of what I call basically a quick iteration loop. I don't have a fancy terminology for it, but think of a loop. If you're at startups, like everybody here, I hope knows that one of the main things about startups is execution speed. Speed is everything. You have to be very, very fast. If you like, a startup is nothing more than a really big experiment. You have a thesis about a market. You have like maybe some understanding of what that market looks like. You try things out, you try them out really quickly, you learn, you take those learnings and you apply it back into the loop and you do it over and over again. And hopefully if you do that over and over again, you'll find product market fit. So I kind of like looked at, we were doing this for 3 years. So like we had a lot of learnings, we evolved this over time, did a lot of different things. If I were to summarize like today, what like the learning process and the loop that we kind of like arrived to, this is kind of what it looks like. I've like broken it down into these 5 terms or 5 different areas, of which probably like a lot of these are common terms that you've heard of before. So you have like discovery at the top, prospecting or finding customers, building and launching, which engineers like we love to build and launch things, closing customers, and then when you actually close customers, how do you support them? Right? And you do this over and over again. It's not like Monday I'm going to do discovery, Tuesday I do prospecting. You're continuously doing all of these things all the time, and hopefully, using that to iterate. So I'm going to start with discovery. Your goal in discovery is to figure out what problem you're trying to solve and for who. We're not even talking about a solution yet. A lot of when it comes to building startups, you actually spend a lot of time thinking about your problem space, really trying to understand what is the exact specific problem that this particular market segment is facing. And in order to do that, you honestly have to talk to as many people as you can and keep an open mind. I mentioned we're my co-founder and I were pretty technical people. We have built these systems at companies before, but we had to kind of step away from this notion of we built this before, so we know exactly how this is going to work. We had to spend a lot of time actually talking to as many people as we could to try to validate, are we thinking about this problem the right way? And then that kind of leads me into this point, which is if you have an unfair advantage, this is the best time to use that. So what I mean by that is, again, we were technical people, being software engineers, having built these systems before, it was pretty easy for us to just tap into our network, talk to a bunch of other engineers and see, are we thinking about this problem the right way? So I would argue, for example, if you're trying to build a foundations models company and you work at OpenAI, probably a good idea to tap into that network first. Use every advantage that you can find. The key learning for us during discovery was actually that narrowing your focus is good. Don't, and I repeat, don't try to boil the ocean. This is something that we did kind of at the very beginning, which was, we're going to be this startup, we're going to be this platform that you can do all these 5, 6 different things in. If you're a 3-person company, that is not a recipe for success. You want to try to focus and be as narrow as possible. And if it looks narrow, you probably want to get even narrower than that, especially if you're going to be dealing with large companies. After discovery comes prospecting. So remember, we didn't talk about solutions yet. Prospecting is all about, once you've narrowed down what your problem space is, now your goal is to find potential paying customers. Or in other words, try to find as many people as you can that have that very specific problem. This is a burning need for them, right? And that's kind of what we did. We interviewed a ton of different VPs of engineering, directors of engineering, so on and so forth. Unfortunately, there is no one size fits all solution when it comes to prospecting. And this is like true of sales in general, I would say. You can try outbound, like cold email. You can call people. You can reach out to them over LinkedIn. You can do events like this. In our experience, you got to basically try everything you can and then stick with the things that end up working for you. For us, a lot of that actually came down to meeting your prospects where they hang out. So building like a technical product, the best places for us where we got the most like traction was places like Hacker News, Reddit, like all the forums where software engineers like hang out and talk about this stuff. This is a big one. The key learning when it comes to prospecting is that it's all about trust. You're selling yourself more than you're selling your product, at least in the early stages. I can't tell you like how many times I reached out to somebody and like we're getting kind of serious about them using Warrant, and I just like asked them like, so what kind of like, like what made the sale at the end of the day? And I would say that 99 times out of 100, they always say, well, it's your team. You might not have everything today or on day one, but you convinced me that you are the experts in your field, and like that's why we ended up going with you. And so yeah, like you're actually selling yourself more so than you're selling your product in the early stages. So for us, that meant like, at least for me, my language changed from saying things like, oh, I think your authorization model should look like this, to no, your authorization model should be set up this way. This is the best practice. This is the approach. We've spent a lot of time thinking about this. Like we're kind of the experts in this field. Cool. So you've done some discovery, you've done some prospecting, you got customers lined up. Now comes the fun stuff, the stuff that engineers love to do, which is build and launch stuff, right? Yeah, I mean, you have to ship. Your goal is to ship. To be taken seriously, you need a working product. I think this is an interesting one. A lot of like startup gurus or people out there kind of give you advice about like, oh, you should sell something before you've actually built it. And I think that that's true to a certain degree, but when you're dealing with enterprises, the bar has really gone up quite a lot in the last few years. When you're dealing with enterprises, like they're talking to a ton of different startups. If you don't have something that's working, someone else probably does, right? And so it's really important to be fast. So optimize for speed, but also quality. Again, when you're dealing with enterprises, maybe don't follow the Facebook model of moving fast and breaking things. Instead, try to optimize for speed and quality. And I would say like, how do you do both? Again, stay very narrow focused. So optimize for depth over breadth. I've talked to so many companies where they're like, yeah, people just promise like all these different features, but they're all kind of like half baked. Instead, what most of these companies are looking for is one specific thing that you do really, really well, better than everybody else. And that's what, can be the make or break moment. Interestingly enough, the key learning for us, at least over the last 3 years, when it comes to building and launching products, and this is very specific to software, is actually related to packaging and distribution of our product. We just kind of like assumed at the very beginning, like, oh yeah, we're building this, software product. It's an API SaaS. Like that's what we're going to build it as, public SaaS. Like you just hit api.warrant.dev and like, that's how you interact with this product. Although that's true for the most part, a lot of the customers we talked to were actually not open to that. They wanted a different way to use this product. They wanted to either like self-host it themselves, or like they were looking for like more of the old school like enterprise licensing way of doing things, right? And so I guess I would say like the key learning for us is that be open to things, meet customers where they are. Like if they're telling you something, and how their industry works, probably listen to that. You might have to explore like novel packaging and distribution strategies, like open source and open core are pretty interesting strategies if you're building, especially in infrastructure. We actually ended up going with this interesting hybrid approach where we have kind of like two parts of our system, one which runs on our own cloud, and then one which is like an edge agent, which runs in our customers' clouds. So kind of like a control data plane separation. But that's something interesting that we frankly only learned over the 3 years of doing this. Finally, we get to closing. So you've built up a pipeline, you've built a product, you've got this product in people's hands. Your goal is now to close hopefully paying customers. That's like the part of this flow. Like especially if you're selling to enterprise, like it's transactional. You're trying to sell product for money. This is the most important part of the loop, but also where like literally everything can and will go wrong. The key learning for us here is that there's actually a lot of people out there that are not serious buyers. They will just want to like reach out and talk to you because they think you're interesting. Like you're building something cool. They're trying to learn from you. And while those conversations are good, like it's in general good to have those conversations, if your goal is to close paying customers, like there's a misalignment there, right? And so the best way that like I found to kind of to figure this out early on is literally to like precipitate a decision point. You're gonna have to be the one if you're doing sales to ask people like, okay, is it time for like, should we talk about next steps? Can you see it? Can you see yourself using this product in production? So on and so forth. Closing is like the most fun and like crazy part of this process. So I actually have like this entire slide dedicated to all the common roadblocks that you will probably see, or maybe considering there's so many startup folks here have already seen. The first one, this is one of my favorites, happens like 100% of the time. We're a 3-person team. We talk to like a large company and they're like, oh, this is really cool. But I spoke to my security and compliance team, like, are you SOC 2 compliant? And so initially we were like, I didn't even know what SOC 2 was. I had to figure it out. Later on down the road, I kind of figured out, okay, now I know what SOC 2 compliance is. We're a 3-person company. Like, we do not have SOC 2 compliance. But in reality, what people are trying to figure out here is like, how serious are you? Do you know what you're talking about? If you're selling to these large companies, like, do you actually understand security? Things like that. And so you can kind of work your way through this as long as you know what you're talking about. Ooh, this is a tough one. You've had some good conversations with like a VP of engineering. You're like, oh, this person's ready to sign this contract. Like, I can feel it. And then they come back to you with like this one email that just says, sorry, we reprioritized. We're going to look at this next quarter or next year. And you're like, oh, well, now what? Unfortunately, I mean, like sometimes you can't do anything about it. I think my biggest advice for this is we learned over time that it's important to set the timeline and understand the timeline up front. Before you even get into serious conversations with folks, enterprises like move notoriously slow, right? So you should try to understand early on what their timeline looks like. Is it weeks, months, years? And then plan accordingly. Oh, this is a favorite one too. You're a small company. What happens if you go out of business or get acquired? And the getting acquired part, like, very much is in our wheelhouse, considering we got acquired. You're going to get asked this a lot too. Like, we're building in a very sensitive area of the stack, authorization. Like, it's a common question people are going to have. If I trust you with my authorization, what if you like disappear tomorrow? What if you get jobs at Facebook and then like say, I don't want to work on this anymore? You have to have a good answer is my answer here. There's ways around this. Like, a lot of founders that I know, they kind of got around it by saying, well, if we go out of business, maybe we'll just open source, all the code. And then you can do whatever you want with it. Because if it's not valuable from a business perspective, like, what do we care? But just be prepared. Your competitor has $100 million in funding, whereas you only have $2 million. Like, how do you expect to compete? Like, why don't I just go with them? This one, not gonna lie, early on, I used to take personally. We actually did not raise a lot of money coming out of Y Combinator. Some of our competitors in this space raised like twice as much, 3 times as much, maybe 4 times as much. The thing I would say is that you can actually spin this question on itself back to the customer or the person you're talking to. The best way to do that is like lean into what your strengths are. So, going back to that point of like, you are the experts in your field. Like, that's how you should basically turn this question on itself. It's like, oh, well, even if we don't have all this cash in the bank, we're still the experts in this field, right? So if you're going with us, that's worth a lot more than current cash in bank. Like, you can always look to fundraise more in the future if you need to. We like feature X, Y, and Z. Can you also, like, I don't know, build us a car, build us this house, build this other thing for us? There's interesting power dynamics at play when you're dealing with enterprises. A lot of enterprises are used to just like coming up with a list of requirements, giving it to a company and saying, now go and build all this for us. I put this one in here basically to say that you don't have to say yes to everything, even if you're a small company. in the hopes of like, oh, maybe this will, help me make the sale if I go build this one more feature. Chances are that's not going to happen. It's fine to say no when things don't make sense for your roadmap. Lastly, can you send over your contract? We'd like to have our legal team review. This one's good and bad. The good thing is this probably means you're going to get a contract and you're going to move forward. The bad thing is that if you're a 3-person team like we were, this can mean some pretty hefty legal bills trying to get a contract done, right? Enterprises have a ton of lawyers inside, the companies that are have nothing better to do than redline all these contracts, send them back to you, get approvals, and all these other things. As a small, fast-moving startup, you don't have that time, nor do you have lawyers on retainer. This is just one of those things that I think you learn over time, but I think the biggest takeaway here is probably around when you're dealing with enterprises, you're dealing with a different price point. So just make sure you account for all of this when you're doing your pricing and figuring all that stuff out. Cool. So I mean, if you got through all that fire for closing a customer, are you done now? Is that it? For us, that's not the case. With our product, there's a little bit of implementation that goes into it to getting people set up using the service. We call that implementation, and then you're probably going to have some ongoing support. For an infrastructure service like ours, we have SLAs, we have guarantees that we give to the customer. If something goes wrong, we need to be on top of it, right? Also, don't forget about renewals. If you sell on a yearly basis or yearly cadence, don't just sell it and then just never talk to that person again. It's probably not a good idea. Maintain that relationship. Enterprise sales is also a lot about relationships, even more so than the products itself. The main takeaway though for us when it comes to support was just set explicit expectations with all of your customers. It turns out that a lot of our customers that actually pay us the least ended up costing us the most in terms of time that we give to them in terms of supporting them. And it's just, in the early days, it's unfortunate because you try to help everyone as much as you can, that's fine. But just account for this because it can burn your team out. And if you're dealing with larger companies, it's totally fine to put, support elements directly into your contract. So I talked a lot. I'm just going to kind of end with a few takeaways here. In essence, it's hard, but small teams can sell to enterprises. But first, you have to decide if it makes sense for you and your small team. If it doesn't, just don't even try it. I mean, if you're fine selling to startups, maybe start there. If you do have to do it, keep it super simple. Figure out and refine what your loop looks like. Just let your customers and prospects guide you. Just keep iterating on that, right? And if you do all of that, you can deal with any enterprise roadblocks, provided also that your product provides value. If they find value in the product, they'll find ways to adopt it and use it. Just real quick, what's next for us and Warrant, you might be wondering. So as I mentioned, Warrant was acquired by WorkOS just earlier this year. If you're not familiar with WorkOS, WorkOS is the all-in-one identity platform. So we enable basically other applications, specifically B2B apps, to get enterprise ready with features such as user management, SAML, SCIM, audit logs, and now fine-grained authorization powered by Warrant. That's it. Moving to Q&A.
You built authorization system which requires code changes. Have you had any customers basically pushing back on because there's a barrier to adoption that you have to change all the code? And how has been your response when customers ask for these things? And then the second question I have, you built a product with 3 people team. How has been velocity and prioritizing customers' requests?
So first question was about an authorization service is very ingrained in your code base, or can be very ingrained in your code base. So how do you deal with customers that have gnarly code bases and maybe adoption is not as easy because you're trying to centralize something, and it's I would actually classify that as somewhat of a people problem in addition to a technical problem, right? I mean, I would say that we're now getting to the point where we're starting to talk to companies that are the 10,000 plus scale. So I think there's some cool innovation that we can do here that we actually are looking into doing, which is, and maybe some of that is being driven by AI and like code generation and being able to, like change things on the fly. So I guess the short answer to your question is we try to find technical solutions as much as we can. And then at some point, it is about like understanding how the organization you're dealing with moves and then trying to like help them basically get to a point where they find success. So I guess partly technical solution, but partly of like a people and coaching type of a solution, if that makes sense. And your second question, just totally blanked on it. Prioritizing when you have three people. Well, it helps if you have well, first of all, it helps if your team is good. You move fast. We like, and also like with a 3-person team, like we're a very senior team. Like we like have, like we don't, no one here is like a beginning engineer or anything like that, right? So assuming all of that is true in a small team, I think like prioritization, honestly, at least in the early days, comes down to what's going to move the needle for us and get us to that like next iteration of the loop. So if you're going to do something that like helps you close a big customer, maybe that's the most important thing you do at the moment, and you just go and do it. Like all three of you just jump on that, right? So I think it's like case by case. Yeah, I don't know if that helps.
Hey, my question is about enterprise deals and with the subscription. Let's say you have either subscription, which is quite, you know, like how to evaluate it, and your customers know for what they are paying. And I suppose you're talking about enterprise deals, which are more like customer like specific and personal to each customer. Can you guide how you define the price for each enterprise, and why do not focus on subscriptions, for example, based?
Sorry, can you repeat the last part? Like focus on what instead?
Subscriptions based.
Yeah, no, good question. So actually, if you go to our website, our default pricing model is subscription based. So that's like what I would say is like our self-serve. If you come to the website or if you're like a mid-sized company, like that's how we would charge you. To your point about enterprises, yeah, it can be like you can have very custom terms per enterprise. I think when you're a small company, you want to try to not do that as much as you can. I know it's going to be difficult. One thing that worked for us really well was Y Combinator actually has a list of enterprise contract templates on their website, and I think it's public, meaning it's not only for YC founders, but those are like it's a set of really like if you were to get those built by like a legal team, it would probably cost you like 5 figures to get built. But these are like templates that they have iterated on from like the countless enterprise deals that their companies have done. That was actually a good place for us to start to be like, okay, this is going to be like our MSA or master subscription agreement, or this is going to be like what our base enterprise contract looks like. And then you use that as much as you can. And then if people have, objections or you'll get a lot of companies that are just like, no, I don't care what you send me. I'm going to use my own paper, my own like contract or whatever. And so it's case by case, but I would say that you try to, use like common like templates or terms as much as you can, especially early on. Yeah, I don't know if that helps.
I think you covered this earlier, but questions in terms of customer acquisitions. How did you approach that? So, is it purely cold outreach, especially for the enterprise customers, right? So that's number one. And going back to the pricing question, right? So, did you have a pilot for the customers? And if so, what are you looking for? Whether it's user adoption, engagement, or the customer feedback, and what kind of feedback you got?
Yeah, no, great question. In terms of like customer acquisition or lead acquisition, I don't think there was one that like, well, okay. There is probably a couple that worked better for us more than others. I think generally it's very dependent on the type of product you're building and you're selling. For us, being a very technical product, Hacker News was like a huge like forum for us. We had a couple of articles that kind of like went viral on Hacker News. They were on the front page. That got us like a ton of signups, even from like really large companies. that you wouldn't expect. But those are folks that are all over Hacker News. So I think that that's like very, very expensive because it takes a lot of time to write good content. But it can lead like over time. Content can actually help a lot. At least for in our like industry, it helped a lot. Then, sorry, what was your second question again? It's just in my mind. Oh yeah, pilots, right. I didn't talk about pilots. We actually didn't do a lot of pilots. It's hard to do pilots with our type of a product because it's very like it's infra and it's like very like deeply ingrained in your product. We did a lot of demos. We still do a lot of demos. Like this is how it might work for you. We'll just like prototype it with you. But like if we've already done the prototyping, in most cases, it's already kind of like integrated with the customer's stack. I guess the closest we got is like greenfields projects. So a lot of companies, if they're doing like a greenfields, like a net new project, will be like, okay, try using Warrant for that. And if that is successful, then we can start talking about, centralizing everything. But I mean, I think pilots can be good. I know a lot of other founders that use that. I think the thing that you have to be careful about with pilots is what's like the outcome that you're looking for. Like set like a specific timeline for it. Make sure that, you have some success criteria. And once you get to the end, like what's the next step? I think that's very important to kind of like hash out. Same applies for things like LOIs. YC always used to tell us that like LOIs are worthless because they don't like letters of intent is just like, oh, I will use your product, but nothing is binding. It's not a contract.
Awesome. Well, feel free to grab Aditya if you have any more questions. Otherwise, thank you so much, Aditya.